Thank you guys so much for joining us today. We'll be starting in about 3 or 4 minutes. Okay. Thank you guys so much for joining us. We'll be starting in just a few minutes.
Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to wait a little bit, see if we can get some, give a little more time for people to register and log on. So bear with us a second.
And please complete the poll if you haven't already done that.
All right, we probably should get rolling, seeing that it is 3 o'clock. I'd like to welcome everyone to, this is the third session of a 3-part series that Mike, Angela, and I have been presenting. The first one was on valuation and benchmarking. The second, which was last week, was on perpetuation. This third one today, we're going to talk about acquisitions. So again, thanks for everyone for attending. My name is Mike Strakoff. I'm head of insurance lending at Live Oak Bank. We are an FDIC insured bank with a national footprint. We have a team of lenders that focus specifically on the industry, primarily providing M&A financing. About 80% of what we do is related to some type of transition of ownership, whether that be a third-party acquisition, partner buy-in, partner buy-ups, things along those lines, as well as perpetuation scenarios. So with that, I'm going to ask Mike and Angela to do a quick intro on themselves.
Sure. Thank you, Mike. Well, if this is your first time joining, my name is Mike Mensch. I'm the CEO of Agency Brokerage. We are a merger and acquisition advisor, which means we help agency owners with valuations and merger and acquisition transactions. For the agency sellers, that's our main business. We help through the whole process of preparing for exiting and going through the sale process. And for buyers, we do lots of valuations and due diligence consulting through the transaction process.
I'm Angela Adams with Angela Adams Consulting. We do consulting for agencies around agency operations, and we do get involved in a lot of acquisitions, both preparing to be acquired, if that's what you want to do, or preparing to do acquisitions. A lot of the things we're going to talk about today are right in our wheelhouse, and we'd love to work with any of you on these things.
Great. Thanks, Angela. And one of the things that Mike, Angela, and I talked about prior to launching this is just we all come from different perspectives being involved in working with agents. So we thought it would be good to kind of have all of us provide our perspectives on the different topics as we've gone through. So hopefully you've enjoyed the first two. I think the third one is going to be great. So thanks again for attending. We asked all of you to complete a poll question or a few questions in a poll prior to starting. So Tracy, if we could pull that up, that would be great. And we'll just take a quick look at kind of what those answers are. So how many agents have you acquired? So we have about 40% that have never acquired, about 45% between 1 and 3, 6% between 4 and 7. And it looks like we've got a couple that are really active, anywhere between 7 and 10 and 10 or more for like 3 agencies. So good mix here. Certainly like to see the those that never have acquired, and I think this will be certainly helpful if this is your first exposure to the topics. Do you have a deal team in place? 12% said yes. More than overwhelming majority will say no. And then what's a deal team? And we're going to talk about what a deal team is throughout the presentation, so I won't spoil it now. Are you actively looking to acquire an agency? About 70% said yes, so you're in the right place. We certainly can help with our insights here. And about 30% no. So whether you're looking today or will be looking in the future, I'm sure this will be helpful. And then what's the most important factor when acquiring an agency? And again, the vast majority said book of business, with profitability being second, and then location, staffing, and pricing to be kind of close thirds, if you will. So thank you for answering that. And with that being shared, we're going to jump right in. So Mike, if you could advance. So strategic reasons to acquire, like why acquire an agency? First being economies of scale. If you have underutilized staff or technology or, space that you're renting, certainly contingent commissions could be maximized with additional volume added to your agency. Also think about, bargaining power with key markets. The bigger you are, you might have some more, weight to throw around, if you will, as it relates to getting bigger as an agency, and an acquisition certainly helps there. Growth much faster than organic. And we're going to break that down a little bit, but you can grow significantly faster through acquisition than you can, on your own or through organic growth. Being part of your succession plan, you might not have the horses in the stable right now to exchange or transfer ownership, and you might be able to find that talent through buying another agency or, finding the talent within that agency to be the next best step from ownership of your agencies. That includes partners as well. So you might be the younger of 2 partners or younger of many partners. And through acquisition, you could find other partners or the opportunity for people to buy your partner out in the future. Geographic expansion certainly makes sense. Interest in getting into another part of town, county, state, even cross country. We have some agents that are looking to diversify what they have in a particular state. Let's say it's, wind prone, or there's aspects of the book that makes them nervous. They might be able to find an opportunity for an agency acquisition in another state or another area of the country or state even, that can kind of diversify what that looks like, or open up more opportunities through having representation in different areas. Add a market. We do have people that certainly reach out to us and find one of the more appealing aspects of an acquisition would be for, excuse me, let's get a message that got in my way. Added markets. So if they wanted to add an insurance company, they could do so via acquisition. The thing I'd caution you there is make sure that the carrier that you're interested in is going to be a likely candidate to appoint you moving forward. There are some carriers out there that are pretty particular on who they will appoint, and acquisitions give them, if they have a appointed agent that's selling, might give the carrier to an opportunity to evaluate whether they want to move forward on that book of business or with you as the new owner. So it's not a given. Those insurance carrier contracts are not assignable. So through acquisition, you're not automatically guaranteed an appointment. So something certainly to consider. Opportunistic. I'm actually, I've been doing this about 8 years at Live Oak Bank and have been involved with M&A work prior to. How many times like an opportunistic situation happens? Like there's a friendly rival agency in town that all of a sudden, the owner has a health issue or has expedited their interest in getting out of the business and approach you to be the potential buyer. And it's not uncommon. I mean, it's not an everyday activity, or a situation, but it certainly can happen. And if you are prepared, it certainly would be something that would be helpful to be prepared and ready to go. And then make more money and a significant return on investment. Obviously larger agency with a well-run agency, you have the opportunity to make more money on that. And down the road, you acquire now and sell later. There's an opportunity to have a greater return on your investment, a very likely opportunity to get a greater return on investment. So having the opportunity to make more money certainly motivates a number of those for reasons to acquire. And Mike, did you have a question you wanted to, or comment you wanted to make? No? Okay. Fair enough. You could advance the slide, please. So here is a display or an example of organic growth versus growth through acquisition. So admittedly, this is a pretty busy slide, so I'll just kind of pull out the highlights. You'll see that there are a couple assumptions in that paragraph after the title. What this chart does is assume that there's a $1 million revenue agency looking to get to $1.5 million and what's involved in that. So the assumptions are a 5% compounded annual growth rate. So the agency grows 5% every year, and it runs at about a 90% retention. So what would it take for that agency to go from $1 million with those two assumptions to get to $1.5 million? And the one thing I will note that it does not account for exposure increases or rate increases. So this is if the world was constant from those two perspectives, what's it look like if you ran a 90% retention, 5% compounded annual growth rate? So the punchline to this slide is it would take about 8 to 9 years for someone to grow organically in that type of environment or that vacuum, with growth and retention being that. So if you compare that to what it would take for you to grow from $1 million to $1.5 million through acquisition, it could be a 4 to 6 month investment. One transaction, you could be there. So the efficiencies are certainly available if that's your goal to grow revenue quicker. Acquisition can be a very short route to make that happen. So 10 steps in the acquisition process. And here I will note that in the prior sessions, we had talked about preparation, self-analysis, valuation. So I'd highly recommend to go back to either session 1 and 2 to look at those topics. So we're not going to cover them in great depth right now. But we do recommend that you have that as a foundation as we kind of go through these slides, because they are certainly important. But I'll just touch on most of these quickly. Outline acquisition strategy. We talked about the reasons to acquire. What is your ultimate goal through acquisition? What does the strategy look like? Are you looking to grow with a particular market? Do you want to get into different locations in the state, et cetera? Go through each one of those examples previously provided. Kind of to develop your strategy. What is it exactly you're looking to acquire and why? Target search. You really want to understand through that strategy, a lot through your SWOT analysis, is what is it exactly, once you know your strategy, what's the search criteria? What do those agents look like? Where are they? Where do you need to spend time in order to develop that? And that will allow you to develop a list of potential targets to approach. From there, obviously, you have to reach out, your outreach. what's your plan around that? We're going to talk a little bit about sourcing deals and how do you increase your success overall in a few minutes. Perform the initial valuation process. We'll talk in later slides about what that looks like and how to provide or what you should ask to be provided in order to do your initial valuation in order to move forward with an eventual offer and purchase agreement, due diligence, et cetera. Secure financing. I'll take this as a public service announcement opportunity. While it appears as number 6, getting financing, if you're going to need it, is going to be a critical point, as you might imagine. So highly recommend starting earlier than later. While it appears to be 6, even if you're not looking right now actively or early in the process, it's never too early to start thinking about financing. Negotiate and execute an LOI. We're going to get into that a little deeper in a few slides, and then perform due diligence. And that's where Mike is going to pick up and talk about due diligence and moving into that purchase agreement step through this process. And then Angela is going to close us out with the close and integration. So preparing for an acquisition, not to beat the topic, but financing, if it's necessary, start the process early. There are some specific tools that are going to be pretty common as you move through this, and familiarizing yourself with them and understanding what they are is going to be important. So NDA is a non-disclosure agreement, which limits particularly you as the buyer on what you can share. It could be mutual, it goes both ways, but it really restricts what you can do with that information. It's really meant that any exchange of information is that for that particular deal. There's usually a time frame associated with how long you're bound by that non-disclosure agreement, but certainly something that it wouldn't surprise me in most cases somebody asks you to sign if you're going to be involved in an acquisition. LOI, letter of intent, we're going to break that down a little further. And then deal analysis spreadsheet. There's a number of things, and Angela's got a spreadsheet she's going to share with you and a tool that she has. And we are looking to provide the participants on this presentation with a tool a little further down the road, but really you want to make sure that you have something to work from to understand what you should be looking for, why is it important, and what information should be gleaning from the information that you've collected. And then determining your ideal acquisition. If you know what you want, and we talked about as you're out there trying to source deals, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that, the more concise and specific you can be on what you're looking for from a revenue size, where those potential agencies are located, type of agencies, carriers, et cetera. The more you can share that with people that may find a deal for you, may hear that story and come to you directly, but you're very specific. So it's not like you'll entertain anything or you'll entertain everything. You're much more concise in what you're after. And I think that will bring more opportunities that would fit in your wheelhouse and really give you the opportunity to maybe eliminate deals that don't fit in your wheelhouse. So it can help attract, but it can also help you through the process to make sure you're looking at these quickly and determining whether this is something you should be spending time on. So the deal team, and this will address, at least a few people that had mentioned what's a deal team. So what we're advocating here, suggesting, is that you have an opportunity to kind of spread the wealth or spread the fun on the acquisition process. So acquisitions take a lot of time, and they can be all-consuming. They can be somewhat of a roller coaster ride with good days and bad days, and the deal might feel dead one day and it's resurrected the next. So there's a lot of information that needs to be collected, and a lot of it needs to be analyzed. So you want to start thinking about what's the capacity of the internal resources that you can tap to help you through this process. And depending on the size of the agency, if you're an agency of 1 or 2 or 3, you might be the only internal resource. So you might need more external help, or if you got managers and a large team behind you, understanding what their strengths are and how they might be able to help in the process is going to be important. And then external deal team. So valuation, highly recommend going back and listening to the first session that Mike spent a lot of time on the valuation pieces and what's important and why it's important. Having an attorney, particularly one that's familiar with M&A, and if they're familiar with insurance M&A, that is certainly very, very helpful and can be, an incredible asset to have. We talked about having a banking partner, and when you decide to establish that relationship, can be at the time of acquisition, but there's nothing wrong starting that sooner. So at least there's some level of familiarity when the deal comes through. And then a CPA, somebody that can give you some sound tax advice as the buyer and the seller certainly have things to navigate from that perspective. So that external deal team can be very important, and thinking about putting that deal team together well before you're in an acquisition can save you time, frustration, and the panic associated with realizing you don't know certain things that you're going to need help on. And then put a process in place before the acquisition. So, thoughts, to kind of stress my last point there, make sure you have a process in place that's repeatable, that there's a timeline, and everyone has kind of a defined role and responsibility. So what are you trying to accomplish? Who's responsible for it? When does it need to get done? And who's gonna, who are the people that are gonna need to see that? And it might be more than one, but everyone's role is defined pretty specifically through their participation in this. So how to find sellers? And I would say this is it's a challenge. A lot of independent buyers have a tough time identifying deals, and there's more buyers than sellers right now. So certainly a seller's market. So that can create additional challenges. When you do find one, there could be more than one potential suitor sniffing around the deal. So we want to give you some insights on how to maybe find deals if you're not incorporating some or all of these now. So there are some online resources: agencyequity.com, bizbuysell.com, and then there's assorted Facebook groups out there. This one is Insurance Books for Sale, that promote the sale of agencies, so buyers and sellers can interact in a Facebook environment from that perspective. So there are some online resources to look for. The one I'll add to online, and it's not necessarily a location or a website, is the concept of screen scrape. And we've had some agents have success with using a screen scrape technology to go to, make it up, but Travelers, to say, hey, I'm interested in acquiring a Travelers agent in these zip codes. The screen scrape can go on Travelers website, and you can use the, locate an agent type page to go and get a list of who's appointed with Travelers in particular geographies, if that's what you're after, or only personal lines, commercial lines. So something to consider if there's a particular market that you're interested, or, members of a certain group, screen scrape might be an option. Trade associations also can be a source. Some, provide some level of connection. It's almost agent.com or match.com for agents through trade associations if they're looking to help their members find potential buyers and sellers. Carriers reps are certainly in the marketplace. They can make some suggestions. Commented earlier, make it known that you're interested in acquiring. So the more people that know, you might get some referral business or referral opportunities from, whether it's the trade associations or carrier reps, et cetera. Good old fashioned marketing and networking. We have worked with a number of agents that have actually hired staff to do cold calling, and that's all they do is contact agents and look for opportunities to acquire. And they've had reasonable amount of success. So much like you would think about how do you grow new business, there's a prospecting process, and a process that you go through to qualify opportunities, and think about that similarly as you're looking for potential agencies to buy. And then contact an M&A and broker intermediary for current opportunities that they might be working on, and to prospect on your behalf. And here I'd just like to introduce the concept of an elevator speech and being prepared and ready to go. So think about, if an agent knocked on your door today and saying, hey, I want to sell to you and tell me all the reasons why I should, you should have a pretty succinct story on your agency, what you do, where do you shine, where you think you bring value to them as a seller, what your values are for the entity moving forward if they were to sell to you, and really what ultimately is the value proposition that you have for sellers as a buyer. So think about that beforehand. It shouldn't be something you come up with on the fly. And like I said, it's likely a competitive situation where you're going to have to sell yourself to a certain degree in order to be successful on these. So as you're looking for sellers, understanding who the competition might be can help you maybe get a quick handle on whether you want to compete on a deal or not. And I think everyone on the call has heard the stories about, private equity and what they're doing in the space and the multiples that they're willing to pay. Again, a reality that, we all face, that they are a potential buyer out there, and they might be somebody that you're not necessarily as interested in competing against, as you find potential sellers. If they're already engaged, you might want to back off on that. But there are serious kind of groups of or people that we could categorize as buyers. The national brokers are pretty active, regional brokers, local, and then the licensed agents. As the buyer gets smaller, you would imagine that maybe the competition's less, or you can certainly bridge gaps quicker, depending on your agency, your value proposition for them as you look at it. Not to say you can't bridge the gaps on some of these other buyers, but it might be a little bit more realistic at times that you're kind of focusing on certain types of sellers and where they are with the competition. So how to increase your chances of success and target smaller agencies. We have an agent I've been working with for a number of years. I think the first time I talked to him, they had about 258,000 or so in revenue. In a matter of, we'll say 5 years, he's acquired about 7 agencies. He's a smidge under 2 million in revenue right now. And the whole approach was buying smaller agencies, those that are under 300,000 or so in revenue. The example I provided, sure, they certainly have some debt that they used in order to acquire those agencies. But you think 5, 6, 7 years out, that balance will be zero, and they're the owner of a significant revenue generating entity that they have an opportunity to do a number of things, continue to grow it, continue to acquire, sell it. It's just a different story than that, agent would be able to do on their own without acquiring those. And the competition's certainly different, less private equity, maybe fewer buyers that are interested in the smaller ones. So you might have a better chance to compete. Know what you can afford, which speaks to talking to a banker if you're going to need financing, for what that looks like, what's the process, how is the bank going to process your request. So put it in context. If you need a down payment or whatever it might be, at least on the upfront, and know what you need to shell out at the time of closing. That can certainly help you understand who you should be running after. Understand the process. Mike's going to talk about due diligence, and Angela's going to talk about the integration. We're kind of talking about kind of preparing, and we'll talk about making an offer in a second. But what is that process? How long does it typically take? Understanding where you are on the process is going to be important. Be flexible when structuring the deal. Don't sweat the small stuff. Good chance you won't get everything you want, but you might have to compromise. Be open-minded to that, and the more flexible you are, the more likely you'll be successful. Move diligently on opportunities. Time kills all deals. So the more it sits, the more you lose momentum, the more the seller might get distracted, maybe fall into the arms of another. So the more you can keep the momentum going and the interaction going is going to be important. And then hire a professional to assist in the search. If you don't have the time and you are serious about acquiring, bringing a third party in could be really important and allow you to be successful quicker. So prior to making an offer, there are some items that we recommend that you view beforehand. Many times you're not going to get everything you want. You probably get, just enough to get a flavor for the agency and, the opportunity to say, yeah, this is something I want to move forward with. But again, not all the detail on that will come further on down. So strongly recommend getting a 3-year financial history, not only of the P&L and balance sheet, but 3 years of commission and contingent income by carrier. Has that improving? Is it growing? If it's growing, with whom? There's a lot of stories that you can start stringing together by looking at that. The active book of business summary. So you understand, what's still on the books. And if you have multiple years of that, you could see, potentially a larger account falling off the books if that's actually the case. Loss reports for top carriers, we would also include on this list, probably production reports as well. But you want to make sure that you understand if there is a loss history that's potentially concerning. Is it, driven by one loss, multiple losses? Is it a systemic issue with the book of business? An employee roster with salary and job descriptions helps you understand the compensation and how things are being spent as it relates to that. It might also point out who the critical people are within the agency for probably future conversations and follow-up. And then agency valuation, I would tell you, as we look at these and people come to us for financing, an agency valuation makes our jobs a lot easier because it's a lot of this information I just went through with you on this list is all summarized and neat columns and easy to follow. So while we're going to need all of this information at some point, evaluation can certainly be helpful to you, but it's very helpful to the finance and banking folks in the crowd. So letter of intent, this, touched on earlier, but letter of intent or the LOI, short, non-binding offer letter, outlines the deals, which we'll cover on the next slide, and then outlines timelines and requirements. So, the non-binding piece is important to understand because a lot of people get, concerned that they haven't seen everything, but making an offer, a written offer can spook some people, but the non-binding aspect of the offer kind of can relieve some of that anxiety for most, but puts timelines around due diligence and requirements, the third-party approvals. One might even be approval by a bank as being part of the deal. So closing requirements, what might be required from an E&O and tail perspective, estimated closing date, and then the exclusivity period, typically 90 to 20 days. And in my mind, this is probably one of the more important aspects of an LOI is it pulls the deal off the street and allows the seller and buyer to focus specifically on the deal. So that's real important aspect of an LOI. All of them are important, but in my mind, this can be very important to make sure that this is not a situation where the seller continues to accept bids. Deal terms, is this going to be a stock or a asset purchase? Is the price going to be fixed, or is there some formula-based or performance-based aspect to the price? And then the terms, how much is going to be paid at closing? Is there going to be any funding to an escrow account or holdback, depending on, whatever the specific issue or concern might be? If there's going to be a seller note, what's the length, interest rate, and any other requirements? It's in what we find in seller notes, no one is the same. You really have to read them closely. We've seen some that have been pretty restrictive on buyers on what they can and can't do, even post-sale. So you want to make sure that they're reasonable and you have yourself, your attorney go through these to make sure everyone's comfortable. There could be an earnout aspect of the LOI. So you want to certainly map out the length and the performance requirements in order to achieve that earnout. And then seller employment or transition requirements, again, really important to spell that out front. That really should be part of your listening to the seller and what their priorities are. But, if they plan on being around, how long, what's their role, how are they going to be compensated? All important things to map out and include in the LOI. And then financing the deal. Again, how to pay for it. We spent some time on the perpetuation session last week on the sources, but there are many. One could be a seller finance, other could be a bank finance. There are non-bank lenders out there. Some carriers continue to provide some level of financing to agencies to help them in acquiring agencies. An investor, family and friends. There are a number of sources that are available. You just want to make sure that you kind of line them up and you got, they're actually available resources when the deal comes to fruition. But if you're interested in learning more about those sources and pluses and minuses, you can certainly go back to the perpetuation session we did last week. And then if bank financing is going to be part of it, you really want to know what the credit requirements are sooner than later, what information is going to be necessary, the timeline and the process. You can't call me today and look for a loan tomorrow. It's going to take some time to sort through some things and get some approvals and sign-ons, and you want to make sure that you're kind of following a realistic path there. And then if there's going to be a down payment requirement, better to know that sooner than later than trying to scrounge money, weeks before closing to be able to achieve whatever that down payment might look like. So again, highly recommend having those conversations sooner than later. So with that, I'm going to pass this over to Mike Mensch to talk about due diligence.
Thank you, Mike. So I get the fun job of talking about the due diligence, which we know every agent loves to dig in and inspect reports and numbers. But just kind of some background. I mean, I've been involved to various degrees in about 400 transactions, seen everything under the sun, looking at retail, MGUs, wholesalers, pretty much everything. We've seen every scenario. What I wanted to really do in this is kind of give guidelines as to the things you should look for, primarily from a financial perspective. So we're going to talk about how to verify the revenues, how to build a pro forma, and then, just some general overview of some other things you should look at through the due diligence. So there's really three components to the due diligence process. There's the financial, which is going through all the numbers and making sure you understand and have verified the revenues and the profit from the business. Then there's the operational, which gets into the procedures, the employee procedures, the carrier relation procedures, things like that. And then the legal, which is a whole assortment of other reviewing legal documents, organizational structure, things like that. So we're going to go through each one of these. The focus is really going to be on the financial aspect, because that is generally the area that people go astray on, and typically the one that is the most challenging to get help on, because a lot of CPAs don't really understand agency operations, where on the legal side, attorneys tend to understand what to look at. So just real before we get in, the diligence process can vary from a few weeks to a few months, particularly if you are approaching a seller that is not prepared. If they're not prepared when you send in a due diligence list, which can vary in length from, short list of a couple of items I've seen all the way to 6 pages of requests. So depending on how prepared the seller is, that process can be a couple of weeks to all the way out for a few months to get everything in. It can be very overwhelming, especially on the seller, because particularly dealing with large buyers, it's not uncommon for them to submit 6-7 pages of request items. There's a couple hundred items on that list. So both it's overwhelming for you because you're going to receive a lot of data as a buyer. It's also overwhelming on the seller because they're probably trying to juggle this on top of whatever their day-to-day job is. And the diligence process can really make or break the success of a deal. The seller can fail diligence, meaning, the numbers they gave you up front don't line up with what you figure out as you go through the actual due diligence, in which case then you've got to renegotiate, and that becomes a mess. And as a buyer, your failure at doing a thorough due diligence can really cause you a lot of pain on the back end. So it's a really critical stage through the process, and we're going to kind of go through and try and give you some guidance as you work on a deal. So we'll start with the financial due diligence, and we'll start with the top, which is looking at and verifying revenues from an agency. So we listed out different sources that you can use to determine the revenues. Obviously, there's what's filed with the IRS in the tax returns. And then there are the internal P&Ls, which surprisingly, they don't always match. So we see that quite often. Then the third-party statements, which are the bank statements. You'll want to look at the bank recs as well if there's an accountant that's reconciling the financials from the bank statements. Another third-party source is carrier statements. So those are commission and production statements. And then the internal management system reports, which you can go slice and dice it a million ways, looking at production by carrier, by line of business, by client, by producer. And you really do want to look at it from all those angles to make sure that you understand the revenue concentration in different aspects of the business. You'll want to look at new and lost business, meaning, you'll get historic financials, but maybe they lost a key account in the last couple of months. So you want to be able to factor that in. And then if they're dealing with agency bill rec accounts, good luck, because it's going to be really messy. You're going to have to get into looking at customer invoices and receivables and payables. And that becomes one of the more challenging aspects for the average agency on due diligence. And then on the expense side, again, tax returns kind of give you what was sent to the IRS and taxes were paid off of. You have the internal financials. You can get the general ledger from the seller, which shows all the detailed transactions that are in the financials, bank statements again, in terms of employee costs, W-2s, 1099s, payroll reports, invoices for different vendors, and then the agreements associated with those vendor relationships. So this is kind of a short list of, for most agencies, this will give you a 90% picture of the financials. Really the process, we always start, I say top down, meaning first prove the revenue because that drives everything else. And then once you feel comfortable on the revenue verification, you dig in on the expenses, make sure you agree with all the expenses that are on the P&L and that the expenses that are historic will be the same going forward. We're going to get into that, which, is how you create the pro forma. Basically, we're going to walk through that. As you're going through all this stuff, be sure that you project payroll off of current comp plans, meaning, again, you're looking at W-2s, 1099s from the previous year. Inflation's a big issue right now, so a lot of staff are getting wage increases, and you want to make sure that you're using current numbers when you're projecting forward. Pay attention to revenue trends and concentration risks. Again, we're going to get into that more, but is the revenue trending up? Is it trending down? Concentration risk deals with how much revenue is tied to one account or a handful of accounts, how much revenue is coming from contingency income or producer relationships. And then when you're building out your pro forma, be conservative. I've seen a lot of buyers get very aggressive on what they think they can in terms of expense reductions post-transaction. Just understand that if you get too aggressive on cutting expenses, the revenue is probably going to follow in the same direction. So I would say be conservative when you're building a projection. What to watch out for, believe it or not, some agencies do have inaccurate financial data. We see it quite often, the P&Ls, the internal P&Ls, not reflecting the actual financial performance. So we're going to show you how to verify that. Be on the lookout for non-recurring income that's on the P&L. Contingency income, different parts of the country. We see a different variety of contingency income, meaning some regions it's pretty recurring revenue, some regions it's very fluctuational. So just look at the history of the contingency income, which carriers is coming from. If there's policy fee income, make sure you understand what is driving the fee income. Is it just from a policy sale? Is it from an ongoing service fee? Are there one-time policy commissions in there, meaning like bond sales or builder's risk policies? And then watch out for non-agency income. The owner may be renting out part of the office, and then some rental income is showing up on the financials as well. And then the last thing on there is client and producer revenue concentrations. Again, you'll want to slice and dice the book of business to look at how much revenue is coming from the top 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 accounts, top 10, top 20, and understand who drives those relationships or who manage those accounts. And same thing with producers. A lot of times what you'll see is their house accounts, which really means they're probably the owner's relationships if they're larger accounts. Okay, so when you're trying to verify the revenues, first off, if it's an agency that has mostly direct bill business, it'll be fairly easy because the commissions are paid to typically direct deposited for the most part. If not, there's going to be a commission statement that will track it out. If it's agency bill revenue, I wish you good luck because that takes 10 times longer to validate than the direct bill commission revenue. You have to dig in and get actual invoicing. You have to get a lot more statements. But so we're going to focus really on the direct bill income. So the way we normally do it is we'll take the management system reports, look at for X period of time. So maybe the trailing 12 months or the previous calendar year, what was the revenue by carrier? Then you go over to the bank statements, you add up all the carrier deposits from that carrier for the same period of time. And then if there's any absence or missing revenue, you may have to go back to the carrier commission statements. So oftentimes it'll look like this, maybe carrier 1, 2, 3, and 5 are direct depositing, carrier 4 is sending in paper checks. So we have to switch over to looking at carrier statements. And then we're analyzing, okay, compared to the internal management system, how much different are the numbers coming out of the third-party sources? A lot of times you'll see variance because what's in the bank account is typically in arrears from what's on the carrier commission statement, which may be off of the management system. So there's usually a little fluctuation in the numbers just on the timing of deposits. But again, if it's direct bill, you should be able to prove 90, 95% or more of the revenue, which really should be your target, since you're often paying on a multiple of the revenue you're buying. So I would recommend setting up a spreadsheet, again, plugging in the numbers that are coming out of the management system, and then adding up by month what you're getting out of the bank statements and what you're getting from carrier deposit, carrier commission statements, and kind of spreadsheeting out the revenue to verify the financials are accurate. The other thing I'd recommend is looking at revenues by month and doing it on a year-over-year basis. So in your data analysis, maybe you can pull it from the seller's reports where they give you monthly P&Ls and you prove that the monthly P&Ls are accurate. If not, you'll need bank statements for 24, 36 months, but you really want to plot it out and see what are the trends, not only year over year, but what the trends throughout the course of the year. Because although agencies have high recurring revenues, there do tend to be seasonality in income. And the reason why you want to look at it from a cash flow perspective is because if you're taking it over and then making loan payments, you need to budget accordingly. So for this example, the agency's got higher revenues March, April, May, and some of the other months of the year. And it's got low revenues towards the latter end of the year and the beginning of the year. So if you bought the agency and you didn't budget accordingly, in this case, the operating expenses and loan payments are about $52,000 a month. So those months of November, December, January, February, you'd be negative cash flow. And if you're not planning accordingly, you're going to have to go back to Mike to borrow more money to make it through that rough patch. So it's good to look at it year over again. Again, it shows you year over year trend plus the calendar year trends just to understand the flow of revenues in. Okay, so verifying revenues, again, you've got a couple sources you can pull it out of. You should look at it from a year over year basis, from a month over month basis. I didn't really get into looking at carrier contingency income, but you want to look at that on a year over year basis, carrier income year over year basis. But now let's get into the expenses. So the biggest expense item, obviously, on the P&L is the payroll costs. So what you want to do is build out a spreadsheet and you plug in, okay, each person by function or position, are they on benefits? Are they not on benefits? You're going to have to true that up. If you're acquiring a smaller agency, they probably don't have benefits. You may have benefits, in which case it's going to be an increased cost. Then you'll look at what did that staff member make in either the last 12 months or the last calendar year? How did that break out? What was their base salary? What was a discretionary bonus, which a lot of agency owners give those kind of towards the end of the year? And then did they earn any performance-based income, like in terms of commissions or sales? And so you really want to dissect the income per person. And then you've got to find out, it's a new year. Did they get a raise? If they got a raise, you've got to increase the go forward projected compensation for that employee. And the whole point is, because especially in an inflationary environment, wages are going up, costs are going up. So while $35,000 increase in payroll is not a huge dollar amount, it's about 15% of the payroll cost here, which in terms of EBITDA margin is probably 4% off EBITDA margin if you don't calculate it accurately. So part of your due diligence should really be building out an accurate go forward budget for all the labor costs. The other bullet point I have down here is watch out for improper employee classification, meaning If the agency has folks that are paid on a 1099 basis, but really they should be W-2. Because again, as you're growing, the bigger you are, the more regulated you become. So like a lot of the national firms, they don't play around with that. You'll probably want to convert those 1099s to W-2 if they fall under all the rules of really being a W-2 classification. And if you do that, then you've got to pay the additional payroll tax, which means you have to budget that into your projection as well when you make those conversions. So that is kind of building a employee pro forma. When it comes to looking at all the other expenses, really, you can get into the general ledger. This is what we do. We get a copy of the general ledger, go through, break it out, and look at each expense category, because most agency owners are writing off, their personal expenses quite frequently through things like the Amex card and things. So you break it out, you get the general ledger, you look at each expense category, and then you can run these beautiful pivot tables and look at what the real expenses are by quarter, by month, and determine which items on that general ledger probably are not real expenses, which ones are newer expenses, because a lot of times if they sign up for a new technology or something like that, you may have to annualize the cost of that, and you'll see that more clearly when you do this kind of pivot table on the general ledger. So this is a quick way to go in, take a lot of data in the general ledger, break it out, and look at where the expense adjustments should be made in each of the expense categories on the P&L. And then the end of that is you're going to build a pro forma where you've made adjustments for different income and expense categories. So in this case, top line, we're backing out interest income that's not related to the agency operations. We're taking out the owner's salary, adjusting the salaries and wages to that projection that we had. And then there are all these other discretionary owners' expenses that are being backed out, and then giving you a real estimate of the pro forma EBITDA, in this case, 33% of the revenues. And we're projecting annual expenses of about $465,000. So we have a detailed pro forma here. And then what you really want to do is going back to your monthly budgeting, take the monthly revenues, subtract out roughly 1/12 of those annual expenses, because the expenses should be fairly consistent month over month. Back out your estimated loan payments, and then look at your real cash flow on a monthly basis. Again, this will help you with budgeting, it'll help you with planning. And if you provide something like this to a lender like Mike, they will give you the thumbs up, because it shows that you have a little bit better acumen than probably the average borrower. But it's a smart practice to do your own budgeting like this. So you'll see again, even though agencies have high recurring revenues, most of them have seasonal fluctuality in revenues and profit, especially when you got big loan payments coming out. So that was a quick run through on doing a revenue analysis and building a pro forma. I'm going to touch real briefly on these other subjects, because I'm more of a numbers guy and these get into more of operational things. It's not really my strength, but the other side of the coin is making sure you understand the agency operations. So, talking about carriers, it's, who is managing those carrier relationships? Is it the owner? Do they have a staff person that is in charge of communicating with carrier reps? Carrier relations are strongly driven by agency's performance. So look at the production loss reports, see for the top, 5-10 relationships, how much new business is being produced, what's the loss experience, what's the retention in those books of business. Because, despite every agency, I think, feels like they have good relations with carriers, but that production report's going to tell you a pretty good idea of what the carrier really thinks. In terms of employees, you'll want to understand the organizational structure, who reports to who in the agency. You'll want to take a look at the employee handbook to understand the policies and procedures that agency had in terms particularly of like vacation time and time off, things like that. How do they handle hiring and training? That'll give you an indication of how well trained the staff is before you even meet with them. And then you'll understand the technology that's being used, The IT infrastructure is the management system on a desktop? Is it in the cloud? If it's in the cloud, what are the security protocols in place? If it's on a desktop, where is it backed up? Is it backed up on site, off site? And then Angela can help you with what are all the real workflows that are being implemented in the management system. But you want to really dig in and understand, how things have been run internally in the agency. What is really the culture of the agency in terms of, has the owner been hands off? Has it been well organized? Are the processes in place? And that sort of thing. So everybody's favorite topic is the legal due diligence. So that's getting into reviewing contracts with third parties. If the agency is a member of a network, the first thing to look at is what's the breakup clause in that contract. It's not uncommon for agencies that are members of networks to not fully understand what the breakup fee is if they have to exit it. So if you're buying an agency that's a member of X network and you're not a member of that network, that owner's going to probably have to pay a fee to get out of it and get out of the agreement. And then beyond that, how does that unwind? Will they release the codes? Do you have to actually get a broker record letter on each account? Because some networks require that. And there's quite a big difference between, having to get a broker record letter from clients versus just moving the carrier codes. If there's producers and employees, reviewing the agreements with them. So the easy ones, the employees, is there a non-solicitation? Are there privacy clauses, non-piracy clause in the agreement? If there are no agreements, that may change your way of handling closing the transaction, meaning if there's no agreements in place, do you feel comfortable closing the deal without having those in place? Getting the employees to sign some type of piracy agreement. If there's one in place, does it have a transfer clause in it where the seller can transfer the rights to the agreement to the new buyer? Producer agreements, we've seen them all over the map in terms of even within one agency, they can have 5 different producer agreements, different commission splits, different terms about who owns the book of business, if there's a retirement payment due, things like that. So producer agreements, you definitely want to read those closely because they can be all over the place in terms of what's included in the restrictions and the rights and the obligations of the agency to the producer. Your attorney is probably going to look at corporate docs, understand who the shareholders are, how many, who owns what percentage of shares in the corporation. You want a list of all the assets and liabilities. So on the asset side, it's not just the furniture, fixtures, and equipment. It's the web domains, all the intellectual property, and proving that the agency actually owns the rights to those things. If there are debts that need to be paid, those will have to be settled at closing. So the attorneys will want a lien release taken care of at or after closing, and all the I forget the name for it, but they'll want a payoff letter from the bank prior to closing. And then the rest of the stuff, licenses and permits, just making sure everybody that works in the agency is properly licensed, that the agency carries all the licenses it needs. The attorneys usually want to review insurance policies and get claims history for E&O policies, cyber policies. So the owner may have to order a 3 or 5 year claims history for their key policies. And then there's an assortment of third-party agreements for landlords. Maybe you want to review the carrier agreements, other vendors like marketing agreements. One thing I will point out is pretty much every carrier agreement says it's not transferable. So if you're a buyer, don't think that just because you acquire the agency, even if you do it as a stock purchase, that doesn't guarantee you that the carrier is going to transfer the appointment to you. It's clearly in the language of most of those carrier agreements that if there's a change of ownership, whether it's through an asset sale or a majority of the stock of the company, the carrier has the right to terminate the contract. So read all those key ones with the key carriers. And then if that agency has made acquisitions, you'll want to review the terms of the non-compete agreement, in particular with the owner, and the purchase agreement. So this is really a short list. Again, a lot of the due diligence lists we see are 6 or 7 pages, but For most acquisitions that you run across, I think this will kind of cover 90% of what you want to make sure you go through. And I could have probably spent another hour going through everything, but we shorten this down to try and give you enough meat on this where you can take it away and have at least be dangerous in trying to do an acquisition on your own. And with that, I will turn it over to Angela.
Thank you, Mike. Now that the paperwork is done, all the due diligence is done, you've celebrated the deal, now the work of integration begins. And if you're an agency doing multiple acquisitions, and we work with agencies that do 10 per year, often the deal team is going to move on to the next deal, and an integration team should take over. They really are different skills, right? The deal team is like your producer internally. The integration team are like your account managers. So you think about that process, the producer sells it, transitions it to the account manager, who then takes it from there. And often the failure or success of these deals long-term depends on this handoff process. It needs to be seamless. There don't need to be any surprises. And you need a process that, as we've already said, is repeatable, that everybody has a clear understanding of who's responsible for what and when things are going to happen. So at Angela Adams Consulting, we work with a lot of these agencies during these acquisitions. And on this next screen, I've kind of taken just a snippet of a repeatable process, right? That shows, and Mike, if you can go to the next slide. That shows the live date. In other words, when are we going to make this integration effective? And then count backwards from there. So many days in advance or on such and such a date, this needs to be the first thing that happens. This is who is responsible for doing it. And if you're doing internally, you wouldn't assign a role, you would assign specific people. So you don't get to the week before you want to go live and realize that nobody's ever changed the downloads, right? Or that nobody's ever done the data mapping to combine the systems, that nobody has compared the benefits between the two different organizations and resolved those differences. So there is a lot to do once the deal is done to make sure you have a smooth integration. And like I said, if you're going to do a lot of them, you actually might use project management software rather than an Excel spreadsheet, but you've got to build something that instills confidence in the people being acquired, that you know what you're doing. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of fleeing, and that's a process that runs smoothly. The next thing that's important is communication, because gossip will run wild in a vacuum. And if there's a vacuum, in other words, there's rumors starting to float around that the agency's been sold, but nobody knows who it's been sold to or whether their jobs are at stake, you could lose valued employees because of the fear that with this acquisition, they will be out of a job. Involve your HR team, let them help you identify employees who might be at risk. The HR folks can get in there and allay some of the fears about what the process is. You also need to communicate with your customers using multiple channels, because again, you don't want fear coming into the process. So if you and agency B in town are merging or being acquired, you don't want agency C going into clients and saying, well, you know, they've sold the agency. Lord only knows what's going to happen now, right? Better to over communicate using all the channels possible, whether it's emails, whether it's social media, whatever those platforms are, including even old-fashioned paper letters, right? Your communication should be upbeat and positive. Make sure that if you're emailing, your email platform allows opt-outs. So you're not violating any rules and laws there. Make sure that you're communicating a positive vision. In other words, you might say things like, with the combined strength of agencies A and B, we'll be better able to handle your account, or whatever it is. Carriers, you absolutely need to communicate, as both Mikes have already said, the carriers are not required to extend a contract to the new entity. So verify in advance, communicate thoroughly and often with the carriers during the implementation process. Do the 80-20 analysis that we talked about in the prior sessions. Know which carriers you absolutely have to make sure you're on the same page with. So now let's talk about integrating 4 different areas. The first, obviously, people and culture, management systems and accounting, banking and branding. We're going to talk about each of these pretty quickly. But remember, the hard work starts after the deal is done. A good analogy here is to think of the Brady Bunch, right? You have 2 families coming together and you've got to make it work. And that's not going to happen without a very conscientious effort. So let's talk about integrating people. In so many of these situations, you end up with an us versus them, and it becomes toxic quickly, and you end up losing good people, right? You're gonna want to get buy-in from both groups. Ideally, if you've got procedure manuals at both, form a personal lines and a commercial lines committee of the best people at both organizations and sit down and pick the best of both. It's important that you don't say, oh, we bought you, forget your procedures, here's ours. Number one, they're never going to follow them. You're not going to get the buy-in, and you're going to have that us versus them that you absolutely don't want. This also gives you an opportunity to make sure you have the right people in the right seats. An agency you're buying may have somebody who is really awesome at claims, and individually as agencies, you couldn't afford to have a full-time claims person, but now that you've combined, you do. So it's a good opportunity to do something like an Omnia profile, identify those strengths, but make sure you do it without fear. Get this opportunity to shift your stars into the right roles. Let's talk quickly about integrating systems. You want to be careful on something as simple as what you do with country club fees or cell phone fees. You want to make sure that on the accounting side, you get consistency there. And generally you end up picking the more generous of the two because you don't want to cut anybody's benefits. But you also don't want to cause animosity and the us versus them by people finding out that, yeah, we're saying we're all one big happy family, but these folks are still getting a benefit that I'm not. So look at all of those things, whether it's country club, entertainment budgets, cell phones, auto expenses. Make sure that you come up with one plan for everybody so that you don't have that animosity. This can take a while, so start early. Just as soon as the ink is dry, start working on this kind of thing. Get help from experts. Sometimes the best way to make sure you don't end up with an us versus them is to almost have somebody mediate something like procedure manuals and say, this is a really cool procedure and out of this one, and this is really cool out of this one, and let there be a third party so it doesn't feel like there are winners and losers, that you're getting the best of both. Even things like how you want to look at future financial statements will determine what your business structure is in your management system. you've got to know in advance what kind of data you're going to want out to make sure you structure it properly in the beginning. Cleaning these things up later is much more costly than thinking it through in the beginning. One of the most frustrating things is getting company downloads and commissions redirected. So you need to start that as soon as possible. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in talking about integrating the banking. One of the worst things that you can do is say, we're going to move all of our banking to Bank A. We're going to close all of our accounts with Bank B, only to find out that you've got $50,000 a month coming into Bank B from carriers on direct bill commission EFTs that you cannot get redirected. One of the things we've also seen is we've got a buyer and a seller. The seller retains control of their own bank accounts, and that's where all those commissions go. And honestly, guys, it can take a year to get companies to move those commissions. And if you've let the seller keep control of those bank accounts for a year, you're going to have to be asking them for that money every month. And that's a problem. Don't blame your bookkeepers for this. It's not them, it's the carriers. And this is one of the biggest problems. So be careful not to close bank accounts until all the commissions are moved. Make sure you've got somebody calling these carriers every single month saying you still don't have it in the right account. What else can we do? It's a hard process. And the last thing to consider when you're integrating is the branding, right? You want to put some thought into this. And again, you might look to an outside expert. One of the most important pieces of the branding is knowing who your ideal client is, and does your branding speak to your ideal clients? A lot of agencies tend to have a more, I'm going to say conservative, others might call it stodgy branding. And if what you're looking to attract are high-tech customers, your branding may be out of sync with your ideal customer. And this is a great opportunity to make sure your branding for the combined entity attracts and reflects your ideal clients. It's just a good opportunity to get it aligned. Make sure that you're redirecting old domains to the new website. And as Mike said, that you own and control those domains, and your social media as well. What social media platforms are you using? What do you want that branding to be? A lot of agencies will operate separately as far as branding goes for some period of time with a tagline under that says part of this group. And then once everybody's familiar, you've done all your communication, you start flipping the prominence, right? So the new is more prominent, the old gets less and less prominent, so that people don't think you're gone. It's just a new branding. Do a full sweep of your digital footprint. Make sure it's consistent. Make sure it's driving everybody to that consolidated platform. So now let's talk through some questions. I know we've already answered 31 questions, and a lot of those questions were about getting access to the recordings for the first two sessions. The first session was on valuation and benchmarking. The second session was on perpetuation. We're glad to share those. So I know a lot of those questions were about that.
We were tempted to split this into two parts just on this acquisition one because we knew it was going to run long. So thanks everybody for hanging on for an extra 10 minutes.
Yeah, appreciate the level of interaction too, all the questions about certain aspects of acquisition. So really appreciate it. I had a lot of fun with Angela and Mike putting this all together. Maybe coming soon, we might have something additional. Need to work that out, but great time through all these sessions, and hopefully everyone on the call enjoyed it. I saw through the questions, hopefully, that if you had an interest, you've reached out or gotten an answer on this particular, on this presentation through the Q&A session. But if you need copies, I'm sure Mike, Angela, and I can provide those at a future date too. So
Yeah. And should we mention that we're going to be presenting one of these topics at the NetView conference in a couple of weeks. So if you're heading out to Austin, come by and see us. We'll be there.
yeah, that'd be great.
And let me just say this too. Mike Strakoff and I were talking at a conference last year and about all the things we wish agencies knew. And that's why we did these sessions, and that's why they were free. Because even though we came from different perspectives, we all felt this was information we had to get to independent agencies. We are all very committed to the independent agency system. We want to see all of you thrive. And please know that we are always here to help you preserve your legacy and to get you whatever resources you need to make the best decisions possible for you for preserving your legacy.
I think that's a great conclusion statement. Well, thank you all for attending. Thanks, Mike and Angela. And we'll see some of you. I've already seen some responses of folks that are going to be in Austin. So looking forward to that as well.
Okay. Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye now.
Take care.